When the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously warned, God is dead, he wasn't celebrating, he was warning us. When we miss his warning, we miss his critique. Friedrich Nietzsche gives an honest outsider's perspective that needs to be evaluated honestly. So follow along as we evaluate Friedrich Nietzsche's famous claim that God is dead from a Christian worldview. So Friedrich Nietzsche is quite often considered the teenager's favorite philosopher because he's challenging institutions, he's challenging concepts and ideas long held that our society is based upon. And so at first glance, it seems like he's a bull in a china shop. He just kind of comes in, there's chaos, he says crazy things, and then the guy dies. And we, for 100 some odd years, have to come after him and untangle all of the stuff that he said. So our task today is to try to untangle some of that. And maybe we recognize that Nietzsche was doing something a bit deeper than just a teenager's angst and philosophy. Maybe he saw something that many people didn't see. And I suggest that's probably what's occurring. So let's take a look at Friedrich Nietzsche and specifically this concept when he says God is dead. Now, first off, we have to understand that Friedrich Nietzsche, when he says God is dead, he says it in a couple places, but famously in an allegory in a poem called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Friedrich Nietzsche was a nihilist and an atheist. He didn't believe God existed in the first place. And so he's not suggesting that God somehow was alive and died. Instead, he's speaking allegorically. He's saying that Christendom was the foundation of Europe and Western society. And when Christendom has failed to do its duty, the foundation which Europe and the Western world was founded upon begins to crumble. When that happens, chaos ensues. A society has to redefine, recreate its foundational beliefs. And so this was a warning that he saw. He believed that the church had failed to do what it was called to do. It had become an institution rather than a true faith. And because of that, the whole thing had crumbled and it failed Western society. And so he was warning that something further was going to happen down the line if we didn't reassess and figure out what's going on. And so we have to first understand he's not saying God is dead as in Jesus died on the cross and never resurrected. That's not his claim. His claim is that the church and Christendom itself has failed to serve society in the way that it once had, and something had to be done about it. So he recognized that God for society had become a set of ideas, a system, not a living reality. Churches had become social orders, but didn't focus on spiritual renewal. So there was a focus on the outside and building institutions rather than an internal transformation. And so Nietzsche wasn't saying that God stopped existing. He was suggesting that God stopped mattering. That's not an ontological claim. That's a big word for meaning. That doesn't mean that God, as a person, just ceased to exist. He's saying in our hearts, in society, that God didn't matter anymore because we weren't putting him at the center of our hearts. Now, Nietzsche is making these claims, and a lot of Christians would tend to agree with his diagnosis of what was occurring in Europe at this time. So when we put ourselves in Nietzsche's shoes a couple hundred years ago, you would say that the church really had failed. You can point to a number of different times during the Dark Ages and during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment where the church had failed in its duty. the church had failed culture and society. It made bad choices as an institution. And because of that, we have to recognize that at least partly Nietzsche was right. The church had failed society and culture. This does not mean that God had failed. When the church does something wrong, that's on us. But oftentimes people blame God when the church does something wrong. There's a difference between God as a person and the church institution. Now, the allegory that Nietzsche is using combines these two, but we have to disentangle them in order to truly understand what Nietzsche is saying. So Nietzsche saw that Christendom was focused on performative faith and comfortable Christianity. It became easy to go to church. It became easy to live in a Christian society while not actually being transformed, having a real relationship with God. And so there was moralism without transformation, holding people to a moral standard without understanding or even caring what that moral standard was pointing to. Right? We understand in the Beatitudes, Jesus suggests that if you read through Matthew 5-8, you see that Jesus is telling us that we live a certain life. Why? Because it honors God, not just to meet the standard. And so Nietzsche would suggest, no, morals and a moral system had been just put upon people and shackled upon them, not for a greater purpose, but just to shackle people. And so we'd recognize this and say, yeah, that is a problem. That does not mesh with our faith. Religion had become a system and an institution which chained people instead of freed people. And so these are fair critiques of Christianity. In fact, these aren't new critiques of the faith. Jesus looked around at the religious system of his day and he said, y'all are whitewashed tombs. What does that mean? Whitewashed tombs means a place where you bury a body, there's death inside, but on the outside it's nice and clean. So these tombs, which are a symbol of death, but they look pretty. So on the outside you look great, but on the inside you're dead. This is a serious critique that Jesus gave 2,000 years ago. So it's not that Nietzsche is inventing a critique. He's observing a real reality, a reality that Jesus had recognized and warned about in his own day. Nietzsche also recognized religious hypocrisy and lip service faith. This is the concept that I'm speaking things, I'm saying words, but I'm not living out that life. I don't have a true faith that's alive. James would put it this way: faith without works is dead. It's not that my works are my faith, or that my faith somehow comes from my works, but my actions prove the faith that's inside. So the actions that I do, the things that I do, are the fruit of the faith inside. And so these are real honest critiques that align with Nietzsche's diagnosis of Christendom within Europe and within the Western world of his day. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything Nietzsche said was accurate, but as far as his diagnosis, I agree with him. Yes, the system had failed. So do we just throw away the system? I would say no, but this is kind of what Nietzsche suggests. And so his diagnosis was good, but his prescription was disastrous. What does that mean? He understood what was wrong with the system, but then what he suggested we do to fix it was disastrous. That was a problem. So he removed God altogether. He said that we needed to replace God with the autonomous self, which basically just means you get to decide what you want to do. He developed a concept called the will to power. And then he suggested that we have a self-created meaning, which is really just subjectivity. And so what he wants us to do is unshackle ourselves from the past, from Christianity, and create a new order or a revaluing of our values that We just need to say this thing failed and we need to move on and find something new. The problem is, and we won't get into the whole philosophical concept here, but a problem with that is without God, you have no objective morality. Without God, you have no objective truth. So you have nothing by which to stand upon to say this is real, this is true. It's subjective. So you have to get everybody together and just say, what do we all agree with? And hopefully use that as a foundation of your new society that you're going to create, a new morality. The consequences of this are fragmented identity, power struggles. If in the system where you utilize will to power, you have power struggles. You have different kings and leaders who fight each other over territories. They want something that somebody else has, and so they take it. You can't say that's wrong objectively. It just doesn't feel good to you. You don't like it, but it might be right to somebody else. So you have these power struggles, and meaning becomes unstable. We can't come to terms or an agreement around just the basics of reality, and because of that, we have these this unstable reality. We just cannot come to an agreement on the basics of life. So how do we move forward? Well, Soren Kierkegaard is writing a little earlier than Nietzsche, and he sees many of the same issues. In fact, I have a previous video that kind of talks through some of these concepts. But let's look at Kierkegaard's prescription. What does he say? So Kierkegaard is concerned as well with performative faith, with a system in place, with an institution that gets between you and God. So Kierkegaard would say that we're always going to have problems whenever something gets in between me and God. So Kierkegaard wants, this is what he says, he wants the self before God. So you standing in front of God. He doesn't want an institution between you. He doesn't want society between you and God. He doesn't want people getting in between you and God. He prescribes, he tells us that true formative faith is when the self is before God without society's intervention. Now that sounds awesome, but what does that even mean? Well, that means that you are supposed to have a direct relationship with God. A good illustration would be like my relationship with my wife. Whenever something happens, I talk directly to her. Whenever we have issues, I talk to her. When we need to prioritize one bill over another, I talk to her, right? We discuss. There's a give and take between me and her. What I don't do is I don't put an intermediary between the two of us. I don't put a whole system in place, a bureaucracy that has to validate, look through, make sure that our conversation is accurate and approved, right? I have a relationship with her. I married her, and so I talk directly to my wife. I don't just write an email and send it through a system that checks all the boxes and says, yes, he said this, he said that. Now we're going to delete this thing out because that just comes off rude or whatever. I have a direct relationship with my wife. In the same fashion, Soren Kierkegaard wants us to have a direct relationship with God. So that's how Kierkegaard deals with it. So Bonhoeffer would agree with the diagnosis as well. So he talks about the issue of like cheap grace, which is kind of like the prosperity gospel. Anybody can have it, and there's really no responsibility on us to follow God in any way. He sees that cultural Christianity is hollow, that basically there's no relationship between me and God. It's just I'm part of a culture of Christianity. And then he sees that Christ without discipleship leads to dead faith. You don't have an active faith in Jesus Christ if you're not digging in daily, if you're not going through the spiritual disciplines, if you're not reading the Bible, if you're not being transformed daily by the renewing of your mind. And so Bonhoeffer answers Nietzsche's critique with discipleship. Bonhoeffer suggests that we need to dig into a relationship with God by reading the scriptures, by prayer, by fasting, by digging into Christian community, not rejecting Christian community. Now that brings up another issue. How do we make sure that the Christian community that we're participating in is faithful to the true Christian standards? Or can I see that this community has fallen into the issues of Nietzsche's critique? And that's where discernment is important. That's where understanding the scriptures is important. Understanding what Jesus teaches. I would suggest reading through what's called the pastoral epistles, the letters that Paul writes in the New Testament that talks about how leaders are supposed to behave and act in the church. And so you look at what Paul says, the standard that he set in place, and if you see that the pastors in your church are not doing those things, maybe you need to step out of that church. Maybe you need to find yourself a community where there's more faithful leaders in your church. And so Bonhoeffer wants us to find a better, a more faithful community. In fact, for Bonhoeffer, and we've talked about this before, but for Bonhoeffer, what he did was he found that the Lutheran Church in Germany had really failed, had completely stepped away from Jesus. And there's a whole history there of the Nazis coming in and co-opting the church and changing theology. And Bonhoeffer essentially just rejects the Lutheran National Church in Germany and creates his own, along with some other people, underground church called the Confessing Church. And he reiterates the biblical standard and says, here's what we believe, and he stands upon Jesus. Maybe you find yourself a church that has done that. It just goes back to the basics and says, this is what we believe. So one of the first things that I do whenever I look for a church for my family and myself to attend is I look at their statement of faith. What do they believe? What is their theological system? I'm going to look at the leadership of that church and say, how are they addressing political issues? Are they engaging in society in a beneficial way, in a loving and caring way? These are the things that I'm looking into, I'm concerned with. So how do we reconcile what Nietzsche has said with the Christian faith? Is there anything good in Nietzsche's critique? I would say first and foremost, when we understand the allegory that Nietzsche was utilizing, not that God has died, but that the church has failed to fulfill its duty in society and in culture, I think his critique is valid. Now, I also just completely categorically reject the assertion that God is dead. Obviously, my faith is founded on the belief that Jesus Christ was crucified, dead, buried, resurrected on the third day, and has ascended to the right hand of the Father. So I believe that God is alive. But I understand that that wasn't what Nietzsche was critiquing in the first place. The critique was against the church. And I think much of his critique is valid. His prescription, what he wants us to do, I reject that. I think that's a bad... In fact, I think we've been trying to do that for ever since Nietzsche wrote those words. And I believe it's a failure. How do we address this? I think first off, we stop asking, is God dead? And ask ourselves, is our faith alive? Do I have a relationship with Jesus Christ? First starts here, right? First starts in my heart. The answer is a relationship. The answer is discipleship. The answer is formation. The answer isn't getting rid of the church. The answer is reforming the church. And I love this. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a kid, he basically said he wanted to be a theologian. And his brothers made fun of him and basically said, this critique, right? The church is dead. It's a failure. It's a problem. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, as a kid, if there's a problem with the church, I'll reform it. It's a bold thing for a kid to say, but I love that moxie that he has. And um, and I want to embody that myself too. The scriptures tell us that Jesus is not done with the church. Jesus said that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and I believe that. But I also believe that the church has failed at times throughout history. Not everybody. The scriptures tell us that God has reserved for him a remnant. So throughout history, you can still find, even when the church was doing very bad things, you can still find a pocket of believers that were doing great things and were still faithful to God. And I want to find that group today. Where's the remnant today? Where can I dig in today? And maybe it starts here. Maybe it starts with me. So let us not be whitewashed tombs. Let us not live in a society where the stench of death is permeating our culture. Let's dig deeper. Recognize that our faith is about a relationship with me before God. The scriptures tell us that we can boldly go before the throne of grace. I don't need an institution. I don't need a person to go between me and God. Hebrews tells us that Jesus is our high priest and he has gone before the Father for us. I don't need a priest or a person. I'm not knocking the priesthood or pastors, but I can go boldly before him because of what Jesus has done. I don't need an institution to do that for me. Hey, look, if this has been beneficial for you, like, subscribe, share it with a friend, do all of that stuff. It's not about me or growing this platform. It's about seeking after God. It's about seeking after his truth. I believe all truth is God's truth, even if that truth is found in Friedrich Nietzsche's work. Sometimes you have to dig through it and say some of this is good, some of this is bad, and you got to dig through that to just figure that out. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to hold all truth against his standard, his scriptures, his word. And we're going to keep doing this thing. So I love y'all. Like, subscribe, all that stuff. And I will get back with you probably in another week. If there's something you want us to talk about, send me a message. I'm happy to talk about a topic. And if it's something that I don't know, I'll bring a guest on and we'll chat about it. So that's about it. I love y'all. I'll chat with you later.